375 million years ago, Earth was a world of water. The continents were barren rock, but the oceans teemed with life, unlike anything we know. This was the Devonian, the age of fishes. And its kingdom was ruled by terrifying, armor-plated predators. But then, the world's very first forests began to grow, and inadvertently poisoned the seas. In one of the planet's longest extinction events, the oceans were suffocated. Yet, in the toxic shallows, an unexpected creature, a humble, lobe-finned fish, would be pushed toward the greatest leap in history. To understand the crisis, we must first meet the titans of this lost world. The Devonian oceans were not ruled by sharks or whales or marine reptiles. They were the domain of the Placoderms. The plated skin fish. Imagine a creature that is part living tank, part guillotine. Their heads and shoulders were encased in massive, interlocking plates of bone armor. They were the planet's first true apex predators. And at the very top of this global food chain, was a monster. Dunkleosteus. A fish the size of a modern school bus. It didn't have teeth in the way we think of them. It had something far more terrifying. Its own jawbones sharpened into massive, self-honing blades of bone. Paleontologists calculate its bite force was among the most powerful of all time. This creature could shear through any other armored fish, and likely even members of its own kind. It was the undisputed tyrant of the Devonian seas. It was a dynasty of armor, a fortress of bone, and it seemed utterly invincible. But the killer wasn't coming from beneath the waves. The threat was growing, quietly, on the land. On the barren supercontinents, a revolution was underway. For the first time in Earth's 4 billion-year history, the land was turning green. Life was inventing the forest. Great tree-like plants, such as Archaeopteris, began to conquer the rock. They reached for the sky with fronds. And clawed at the earth with something the planet had never seen before. These plants had evolved deep, powerful, complex root systems. For millions of years, these roots did their work. They cracked rocks. They churned the soil. They pulled up buried minerals. They were terraforming the land, unleashing its locked-up nutrients. And then it rained. For millennia, rain washed over these newly vitalized continents. It carried trillions of tons of this new, nutrient-rich soil into the rivers and then into the seas. To the life in the ocean, this was a sudden, endless feast. The surface algae, fed by this unprecedented deluge of phosphorus and nitrogen, exploded. The Great Bloom. The oceans of the world did not just turn green. They became a thick, planet-spanning slick of life. A suffocating blanket blocking the sun from the reefs below. But the real catastrophe happened when this massive carpet of algae died. It sank. A constant, global rain of organic matter falling into the deep ocean. And in those dark, cold depths, an army of bacteria waited. They began to decompose this endless feast. And this bacterial respiration consumed the ocean's most precious resource. Oxygen. The deep waters began to suffocate on a planetary scale. This wasn't a fast, fiery apocalypse. It was a slow, toxic, and unstoppable strangulation. Scientists call this a eutrophication event, a process that creates vast, lifeless, anoxic dead zones. Today, we see this in polluted lakes. In the late Devonian, it happened to the entire global ocean. The armored Placoderms, adapted for the deep open waters, had nowhere to flee. The mighty Dunkleosteus, the apex predator, was now gasping for breath in its own kingdom. Its bony armor, once a fortress, was now just dead weight. It dragged the giant down into the black, toxic mud it could no longer escape. The trilobites, the magnificent reef systems, the deep water specialists. They all vanished, joining the armored tyrants in a silent graveyard. The dynasty of armor was broken, not by a greater predator, but by the planet's own runaway biology. The oceans were dying. But life is clever. It doesn't just endure, it escapes. The world was quiet. The deep oceans, once the engine of life, had become a planetary graveyard. The age of the great Placoderms was over, forever. For millions of years, this toxic state persisted. The dominant ecosystem on Earth had been decapitated, leaving a power vacuum unlike anything in history. But in the shallows, life clung on. In the brackish, muddy estuaries and river deltas, where the forest's nutrient-rich runoff was most concentrated, the water was warm, choked with debris, and desperately poor in oxygen. It was a terrible place to live. But it was also the laboratory for our own deepest ancestors. Here lived a different kind of fish, the Sarcopterygii. The lobe-finned fishes. They had a secret. In fact, they had an entire toolkit for survival. It was a set of adaptations that, in the old world, were modest. But in this new, suffocating world, they were revolutionary. Their first tool was a pair of primitive lungs. They were simple air sacs, evolved as a buoyancy aid. But when the water had no oxygen, these fish could rise to the surface and gulp the air above. While the gills of other fish found nothing, their lungs gave them life. Their second tool was their fins. They weren't the thin, ray fins of a modern goldfish. They were thick, muscular, and fleshy, supported by a system of robust internal bones. One bone connecting to two bones, connecting to a spray of smaller bones. If that pattern sounds familiar, it should. It is the exact same pattern in your arm. And in this shallow, debris-filled water, these fins were not just for swimming, they were for pushing. They could prop themselves up on the muddy bottom. They could navigate tangled roots. This fish, a creature like Tiktaalik, was the only one equipped to survive the very conditions that killed the titans. The deep-water Dunkleosteus suffocated. The shallow-water lobefin simply lifted its head above the water and took a breath. The extinction event didn't just kill their predators, it trapped them in the perfect crucible. Behind them, a toxic, dead ocean. In front of them, a shoreline rich with insects. And completely empty of vertebrates. The crisis had turned their fins into limbs. It had turned their air sacs into lungs. It had given them all the tools they needed for an escape. The greatest leap in the history of life was not an act of courage, it was an act of desperation. The water was a toxic prison. The land was an open, empty continent, rich with plants and insects. Pushed by necessity, the survivors hauled themselves out of the suffocating shallows. First, for just a moment. Then, for minutes at a time. They used their powerful, limb-like fins to drag their bodies onto the mud. They used their new lungs to breathe the rich, unfiltered air. They were the first. These were not just fish anymore. They were tetrapods, the four-footed pioneers. Creatures like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. They were the definitive vanguard of an Earth that had waited 4 billion years for vertebrates to arrive. The death of the ocean's armored kings was the birth of the land's walking dynasty. Think of every amphibian, every reptile, every towering dinosaur. Every bird that circles the sky. Think of the mammals, the primates, and eventually think of yourself. All of us trace our lineage, our arms, our legs, our very breath, back to these humble, gasping survivors that refused to die in the mud. The Devonian extinction was a terrible, suffocating crisis. But like all great extinctions, it wasn't just an end, it was a catastrophic opportunity. It cleared the board, removing the invincible tyrants of the sea. And it gave the entire world to a new kind of hero. A hero that didn't just survive the crisis, but left that old world behind entirely to inherit a new one. Life finds a way, not always by withstanding the fire, but by finding the path around it. From the death of one age, the seeds of the next are always sown. The great survivors are not just those who endure the darkness. They are the ones who are remade by it, to conquer the dawn. If you would like to join us on our next expedition into Earth's darkest hours in search of the light of life, consider joining our Researchers Guild by subscribing to the channel. And let us know in the comments. What adaptation do you think was more important for leaving the water? Lungs or limbs?